Principally look at two chapters in the book of 1 Kings, probably two of the most well-known chapters in this series that we've been looking at. These two chapters deal with Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Really, it's more so God's confrontation with this idol, this false god Baal. And Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets are their proxies, if you will, or the ones that they use to fight the battle. These are great chapters. Almost as you read these chapters, you can see Elijah standing for the Lord. You can see his faith being affirmed. You can see almost the victory that the Lord shows, but then the devastation that Elijah feels when the people do not turn their hearts back to God. And that really takes up the rest of chapter 19, how Elijah deals with that disappointment. That and in his personal life, and to realize that who God truly is to him. So let's turn our attention. We've got a lot of material I'd like us to cover and think about together tonight as we look at these two chapters. And as this text begins, it begins with these words in verse 1 of chapter 18. It says, "Now it happened after many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, 'Go present yourself to Ahab, and I will provide rain on the face of the earth.' So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria." I want us to notice two things from this opening thought. And the very first of those is it says that many days had passed, and now it was in the time of the third year. I want you to realize from Elijah's perspective, the last 3 years, as we've been looking at, have prepared him for this moment. It was to reaffirm his faith, to kind of shore up his confidence in the Lord. The time that he spent by the brook that eventually dried up, or when he was at the widow's house in Zarephath, were all to prepare Elijah for this moment. Basically, Elijah has waited 3 years of his life to make this one stand for the Lord, to make this one statement for the Lord. And now it was time. But there's a second thing in this verse that I think is just really important for us to see, and that's this statement, where God says, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will provide rain on the face of the earth." I think that is an amazing testimony about God, that God, despite Ahab's rebellion and wickedness, he still had great concern for the people, and God's anger would not always burn against Israel. It kind of reminds me of a passage from Micah chapter 7 and verse 18 where the prophet Micah said this about the Lord. He said, "Who is a God like you, who pardons wrongdoing and passes over a rebellious act of the remnant of his possession? He does not retain his anger forever because he delights in mercy." And in this first verse of 1 Kings chapter 18, I believe we begin to see the mercy of the Lord. He is going to send the rain. He is going to bring the rain to the people. As the chapter continues on, in beginning in verse 3, we're introduced to this figure by the name of Obadiah. Obadiah is the steward over Ahab's household. And what the story tells us as it begins to unfold, that Ahab decides to survey the land. He sends Ahab one direction and he goes another. And they're to look around the springs and the oases and to look for fodder for the livestock so they wouldn't perish in this drought. Now, as Obadiah travels, he meets Elijah. Elijah, who the Lord sent to go back to Ahab. And as he meets Elijah, he recognizes him. He calls him master. And what does Elijah tell him to do? Elijah tells Obadiah to go and tell Ahab that he's found him, to go and tell Ahab that he's there. And Obadiah is concerned about that. He says, "What sin are you bringing up before the Lord?" It's as if he expected the Lord or the Spirit of the Lord to whisk Elijah away again, and he was going to be left taking this news that proved to be false to Ahab, and he was afraid for his very life. But Elijah told him, and he sent and brought this news to Ahab. And so Ahab and Elijah are going to meet, and the conversation that needs to take place will take place, and the confrontation will ensue. But I want us to think just a little bit about this figure, Obadiah. I mean, we're in the midst of this story about Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel, and all of a sudden we kind of take this sharp detour and begin to look at this seemingly who maybe is insignificant to the larger story. We look at this figure, Obadiah. We're told a couple of things about Obadiah. The very first thing we're told in verse 3, besides his relationship to Ahab, is that he feared the Lord greatly. And his proof of that, or proof of his faith, this compelling proof is given in the text. What's he do? When Jezebel's out killing the prophets of God, Obadiah stands up and he hides 100 of them. He divides them into 50s and hides them in caves and provides food for them. Obadiah puts his faith to the test. He puts his faith out there. And you go, well, that's pretty cool. But the fact is that would be astounding. In the court of the most wicked king Israel had known to this point, and maybe you could make an argument the most wicked regime that it will ever know, this man's faith, he says he feared the Lord greatly. And I think that's something we need to take note of. I mean, it's really easy. We take note of those people who do evil during good kings' reigns. But we ought to just celebrate the fact that there was a man here who served the Lord and feared him greatly. Charles Spurgeon said this. He said, account it for how you may. It is a singular circumstance that in the center of the rebellion against God, there was one whose devotion to God was intense and distinguished. As horrible it is to find a Judas among the apostles, so it is grand to discover an Obadiah among Ahab's courtiers. I mean, isn't that kind of cool? I mean, Elijah struggled with this a little later in 1 Kings 19, thinking he alone was left, but God said there's 7,000 who have not bowed their knee to Baal, just like Obadiah in their midst, this man of great faith. But we also have to recognize, as great as his fear of the Lord is, this was a man who stood betwixt and between things. And what I mean by that is, you know that the fact that he rose to be steward over Ahab's house, you know that when he was being sent out to look for grass, the temptations that had to be placed in his way. When he has that conversation with Elijah, there's 9 verses that record that conversation between Obadiah and Elijah. And you know, in those 9 verses, 6 different times the word master is found, the word servant is found twice. And the point being is it seems like Obadiah, even though he feared the Lord, the temptation was there for him to divide his loyalty between 2 masters. That temptation was always there. And the point being is with Obadiah, that could no longer be the case. That's what Elijah was coming to present, this either-or circumstance to the children of Israel. So what could be the literary purpose of this interlude with Obadiah? Again, it takes up 14 verses of roughly a 40-odd verse chapter. It's a pretty significant portion. So let me suggest 3 ideas that this story, this portion of the story does for us. First of all, I think in some ways it's how the Lord chose to reveal to Elijah how bad things really were. Not only was the famine in Phoenicia, it was also in Israel. And not only was the famine in Israel, that we see a lack of spirituality. The fact is the prophets of God were being killed by Ahab, most notably Jezebel. Secondly, I think it is also to reveal to some degree the authority that Elijah has. Do you realize that when Obadiah, we're not told they knew each other before, but Obadiah, he comes and meets Elijah, recognizes him, and the very first thing he does is he calls him master. He recognizes him as someone who had greater authority than he did. And I don't know if you kind of caught it as you read through 1 Kings 18 and 19, how many different times that Elijah tells Ahab what to do and Ahab doesn't. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that Ahab had a great respect for Elijah. That may show something amiss in Ahab's character, but it's kind of weird that here you've got this enemy or troubler or causer of distress, and yet you choose to do exactly what he says. I mean, look down in verse 16. So we read this. It says, so Obadiah went to meet Ahab and informed him. And what did Ahab do? He went to Elijah. He went to him as if a lesser was going to meet someone greater versus just the opposite. So it does that. But I think the big purpose of this, and this is just my suggestion, is that in some way Obadiah stands for all those who are godly in Israel. All those who tried to serve the Lord and fear the Lord. And Elijah is coming at this point and says, you've got to make a decision. You have to stand up for the Lord. You can't in any way be this person who's betwixt and between. You've got to make a decision. And I think in some ways, Obadiah represents the godly portion, that 7,000 that's alluded to in 1 Kings chapter 19 that are present within Israel. So I'm just going to tell you, as you read this first section, it seems to me there's some things that just kind of stand out as kind of just really ironic. I mean, again, as wicked as Ahab is, we're still dealing with the children of God, right? And what we find in Ahab is Ahab's more concerned about the lives of his livestock than the lives of the prophets of God. He's more concerned about the physical drought that his nation's experiencing rather than the spiritual drought that they're in. And you find these great ironies at conflict here in this text. Somebody kind of put it this way. He said, we might have supposed, talking about Ahab, that he would have set himself to alleviate the miseries of his people. And above all that, he would have turned back to God. But no, his one thought was about the horses and mules of his stud. His only care was to save some of them alive. What selfishness is here? Mules and asses before his people, seeking for grass instead of seeking for God. I mean, that's what we see in Ahab, this great irony presented here at the beginning of this story. But Ahab and Elijah eventually meet. And when they meet, Ahab confronts Elijah and it says, is this you, the cause of disaster to Israel? More of our translations say, is this you, the troubler of Israel? That's kind of the same kind of, the one that brings calamity, the one that brings chaos instead of peace, the one who troubles or brings misery. Is that you? As if he well didn't know. But the thing is Elijah here stands with bravery and confronts Ahab to his face and using a play on words and says, not I who's the trouble of Israel, but it is you and your father's house in verse 18. He says, I have not brought disaster to Israel, but you and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and you have followed the Baals. It's not me who's troubling Israel, but you and those of your ancestors. I tell you, as these chapters unfold, every chance encounter we have with Ahab, more of his character is being revealed, and the more you just kind of scratch your head about him. I mean, here he kind of fails and he needs to take a basic course in logic, right? How could you accuse Elijah being the troubler of Israel when you don't acknowledge that his power comes from God? How could he trouble Israel at all unless God had power? And he doesn't even seem to recognize the lack of logic in his own accusations. So what does Elijah do? He proposes this contest, right? A contest that would once for all settle the dispute, is God real, or who is the greater God, if you will, from their perspective. And so what he tells Ahab to do is to gather the prophets together, 450 prophets of Baal and 400 of the Asherah, prophets of the Asherah. Now, the thing is the way the story unfolds, that other 400, the 400 of the Asherah, they must not show up. That's the only thing I can conclude. We're only really dealing with the 450 prophets of Baal as the story begins to unfold. And so he sets out for them this contest. Everybody loves a good contest, right? We're going to decide this on the field of battle. We're going to decide this on the court. And here's the challenge. We're going to take sacrifices. We're going to prepare them. We're going to lay them on wood, but there's not going to be any fire. And whichever God reveals himself will be God. Will be the true God of Israel. Will be the one with the most power. Will be the one that you ought to pay homage to. Now, where he chose to have this battle was a place called Mount Carmel. And it was probably the perfect choice for this battle, at least from the perspective of those of Baal. Mount Carmel was located really on the border between Phoenicia and Israel, right? So it gave the Baal people home court advantage, if we want to keep using a sports metaphor. And it was also a place of storms and lightning. It was a place that Baal was worshipped. It was giving him every advantage. And they attributed much of the fertility around Mount Carmel to Baal. I mean, the plain of Acco, it was fed by two different rivers, the river Naaman and Kishon. And they would bring soil down from the Galilean highlands. And it was just a rich territory. And they attributed all this to Baal. And he says, I'm going to go right here. And this is where we're going to hold this contest. We're going to decide this issue once for all. Now, to the credit of the prophets of Baal, there doesn't seem to be any hesitation on their part, but they decide to take up the challenge. Now, before we get into the contest itself, I want to look at a phrase found at the end of verse 19 of chapter 18. Here's the contest. Now then, send orders and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. Now, if you want one phrase that would distinguish the regime of Ahab and Jezebel from the previous regimes, it's this verse. Because Baal worship had already been around. People had already set up high places. People had already begun to bow down. But the difference between what had happened before and what was now happening in Ahab and Jezebel's reign was it was state-sanctioned. When it says they were eating at their table, it means that the state, the government, the king and queen were supporting Baal worship and their prophets. It was state authorized. It was legitimized. And so that was one of the main differences. Who is going to be the official God of Israel? And so to kind of think about that, maybe we ought to run through a little, we'll get into the contest. So the people, they come. How many people are gathered, we don't know. It seems to be a large crowd just by inference in the text. And when they come, Elijah has these words for them. This question, how long are you going to struggle with the two choices? Now, the root words of this term, people come up with different ideas. One is, how long are you going to hop between branches? Have you ever seen a bird in a tree and it just kind of bounces from one to another? That's what he's comparing them to. He says, how long are you going to do that? Or how long are you going to struggle? That word comes with the idea of limping, dragging. How long are you going to drag your feet? In our terminology, he says, how long are you going to straddle the fence? Or how long are you going to put off from making a decision? How long are you going to tolerate this? Now, how did the people respond? Well, this text says they didn't answer a word. And I find that really striking because what would we normally do? I mean, we would want, Elijah here is this big-time prophet. I mean, at the very least, you would think they would give mouth service. Oh, we love the Lord. Oh, we honor God. But they don't say a word to this because they understand, I believe, really what Elijah's getting to. And it goes against what they would desire. It wasn't a question of serving Baal and God, but they had to make a decision. The issue is not whether Israel wanted to reject Yahweh and choose Baal, but rather to serve them both. Elijah called for an either-or decision. That's what this contest represented. You couldn't entertain Baal in your heart and give lip service to God, or vice versa. You had to make a decision. Now, before we get into the contest, I want to touch on verse 22. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 22, we read this, where when Elijah speaks to the people, he says, I alone am left as a prophet of the Lord, while Baal's prophets are 450 men. Is that a true statement? The fact is, it's not, right? I mean, God reassures him that in 1 Kings 19. There's others like him. But even in his conversations earlier with Obadiah, he knows that there's 100 left. Now, to give Elijah the benefit of the doubt, maybe he's saying in this verse, there's no prophet like me, or there's no prophet who's willing to stand in this contest. But I think more than that, I think this reveals a little bit of a chink in Elijah's armor. And what I mean by this may be just an indication of a slight degree of pride. Because that's what he struggles with in 1 Kings 19. He sees himself as this lone warrior for the Lord, and no one else is there. So this may be just a slight revelation into a chink in his armor. So let's look at the contest in kind of a timeline. So they give 2 oxen. And you know what? Elijah, being the fair individual, he allows the prophets of Baal to choose first and to act first. I mean, when you kick off in football, you let the other team they get to receive. And that's kind of what he does here. And so the prophets of Baal begin to prepare their sacrifice. And the entire time, Elijah remains quiet. The prophets began to call on Baal to answer. And again, Elijah waits quietly. You can almost imagine the scene there. I mean, as the morning begins to wear on, they become more and more emphatic. They begin to dance around their altar, trying to call their God down, to act, to intervene for them. Their voices get louder. Their voices get more strident. But here to the side, Elijah just simply waits quietly until noon comes. As noon begins to arrive, as the day begins to wane, the prophets keep trying to arouse their God, and that's when Elijah begins to taunt them. Now, I want you to understand, when we read that, we kind of chuckle. Look at chapter 18, verse 27. It says, it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice, for he is a god, and either he's occupied or gone astride or is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened. The point is this would have been unheard of in the ancient Near East. And what I mean from that is most of the Near East was represented by a polytheistic worldview. And while they may have not worshipped a particular idol or deity, they did not want to offend them, so they would never speak ill of them. But here we have Elijah coming and taunting them, confronting them. But not only just taunting them, these are not words that are pulled from just the thin air. These are the very words that some of their ancient legends say that the reason that Baal wouldn't respond. You see, sometimes Baal didn't listen to his adherents according to their own literature. That sometimes he was busy or occupied or on a journey. Sometimes Baal was even dead and he had to be resurrected before they would come upon him. And so here Elijah is taunting them. Do you have to speak loudly? But he's a god, right? Is he occupied? In fact, that may be even more of a crass term than what is in our English Bibles. Some suggest it means, is he busy relieving himself? And he goes on to taunt them in this manner. And the prophets began to cry louder, and they become more animated. And as the afternoon begins to wear on, they begin to slash themselves with spears and swords. And over here to the side, Elijah begins to rebuild the altar. The altar that had either been destroyed or just lain fallow. He takes 12 uncut stones, just like Moses did on Sinai, just like Joshua did at Gilgal, and he rebuilds the altar of the Lord. I'm going to tell you, I think Elijah was very much aware of what he was doing. He was rebuilding that which was broken. He was raising up that which had been diminished. And what he was doing with the altar of God, I think he very much was hoping he was doing for the people of God. So he rebuilt the altar there using 12 stones to represent all of Israel, not just the 10 northern tribes, but all of Israel. And he used the same for the water, right? When he calls upon them to take the pitchers of water, and he pours it on both the wood and the sacrifices. He has them use 4 pitchers 3 different times, again for a number of 12, maybe representing that Israel was meant to bring refreshment to the nations. And as it goes on, people begin to lose interest in the prophets of Baal. And as the scene continues, it gets to the point that everybody is beginning to look at Elijah. And as it comes time for the evening sacrifice, which is roughly around 3 o'clock according to Josephus, the prophets of Baal give up, either due to fatigue or despair. And that's when Elijah prays to the Lord. Let's just read this prayer quickly together. In 1 Kings chapter 18, look at verse 36. At that time, the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known to you that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again. It seems to me that there's three major components to Elijah's prayer. First of all, that the people would know that Jehovah was God. And secondly, that they would know that Elijah was the one sent by Jehovah to do these things and speak for him. But the main thrust of this prayer is that what God would be doing here today would turn the people's hearts back to him. That's what was motivating Elijah. He wanted not only God to be vindicated, but the people to be turned back to him. And as he prayed, what happens? God answers with fire. God responds. I tell you, everything in this story is meant to make us understand that the only way that God would triumph over the people of Baal, whether it's wedding the sacrifice or doing this on Mount Carmel, it was going to take a divine act, a supernatural act. And God responds in kind and declares himself without question. And the people respond, at least initially. And what do? They set out and they kill the prophets, as they should have done all along. Anyone who would offer something false to a false god was meant to be killed, and we see them responding in kind. And so this chapter winds down as it begun, talking about rain, talking about water. And Elijah turns to Ahab and says, you know what? You need to get on home because it's fixing to rain. And he goes back up on the mountain, he and his servant, the 7 times they look out to the sea, and finally a small cloud appears, and the rains begin to fall. But I want you to see, it's not just rain. What it is evidence of God's total victory over the ideas and the mythology of Baal. It was God. What happened to the prophets of Baal? The prophets of Baal, he couldn't even protect those who follow him, but God preserved the life of his prophets. Baal, this god of lightning and rain, he couldn't even cause lightning to come down and strike dry wood and burn up a sacrifice. He couldn't send his rain on people to preserve their lives, but Jehovah God could. This rain was more than just a little thunderstorm. This was a declaration that God is sovereign not only in Judah, but also Israel and even into Phoenicia. This rain declared God's victory. And then Elijah takes off and does a cross-country track and tries to beat Ahab back to Jezreel so he could tell Jezebel these things before Ahab. And so that's really chapter 18 in its conclusion. I want to see something about this chapter that I think is really neat in the bigger story of the Bible. And it comes from this quote. It says, the whole chapter is seen to have a single motive from beginning to end, the bringing of rain, that Yahweh's supremacy may be established in Israel, not by a barren Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhic victory is like victory, but it hurts the one victorious. You go and you win a victory, but it cost you a great deal. So he said, not by a barren Pyrrhic victory through a supernatural firebolt, but by the meeting the crying needs of his people for water. You read that and read this drought and God sending this life-giving rain. Does that remind you of anything else in Scripture? That theme all the way runs through Scripture. And you get to end in a place like John chapter 4, and Jesus promising life-giving water. That's what this story is about. The picture even going forward. God bringing life-giving water to his people. So, chapter 19. Chapter 19 begins with Ahab telling Jezebel this news. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more so, if by about this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them." Do you see that phrase? Ahab told Jezebel everything. And all she could take from that was, I'm going to gain vengeance. Do you talk about spiritual dullness? You talk about a heart that is calloused and hardened, that no good news could penetrate? Right here's a picture of it. Ahab told her everything, how God won this resounding victory on Mount Carmel, how he dried the drought that would lasted for 3.5 years, he brought rain, how he lit dry wood and took up the sacrifice. And yet all she could think about was taking vengeance. That's spiritual dullness. That's being calloused of heart. And that's how she responded. And that's where we begin to see Elijah to fail. He heard this news, and what does the text say? It says he was afraid, verse 3, and arose and ran for his life. Someone said it this way. He said Elijah failed in the very point at which he was strongest. And that is where most men fail. In Scripture, it is the wisest man who proves himself to be the greatest fool. Just as the meekest man, Moses, spoke hasty and bitter words. Abraham failed in his faith, and Job in his patience. So he who was the most courageous of all men fled from an angry woman. I mean, he was afraid for his very life. And the fact is, as we look down through the text, if we look down to verse 10, he talks about, I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. He was afraid. He stopped putting his confidence and trust in the Lord. He stopped listening to the words of the Lord, but rather the words of this woman Jezebel. But I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's all that the problem was. In verse 4, it makes this statement when the angel comes to him down in the desert, when he went a day's journey into the wilderness. He says, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers." When I read that statement, I don't know what you understand from it, what I understand, and there could be other possible interpretations. It was not only fear that drove Elijah, it was a sense of failure. That I tried to lead these people back to you, O Lord. And just like my fathers did, just like Moses did, and that generation had to die off in the wilderness, they did not listen, they did not follow. All of my efforts were in vain. So it was not only fear that seemed to motivate Elijah. I think there was a sense of failure and inadequacy or doubt on his part as well. And what happens? He takes off running, and the text says in verse 3, he makes his way down to Beersheba, which is really the last civilized point in Judah. And what's he do there? He leaves his servant. Now, that just seems to be an insignificant detail, but I would suggest to you that may be an indication that Elijah is hanging up his hat. He's leaving his servant behind. He's not only running off into the desert fleeing for his life, he's just, I'm done with this. I am no longer the prophet. I'm leaving my servant behind. And he travels a day into the wilderness. I'll tell you, these first 3 verses are kind of shocking. And for somebody who's just read 1 Kings chapter 18. I mean, the whole story seems to turn. It says in these 3 short verses, the writer has totally changed the flow of the story. Victory seems to be transformed into defeat, the brave prophet into a cowering refugee, and the victory over death and Baal into an opportunity for death to reassert itself through Jezebel's oath to take Elijah's life. How will the Lord prove to be God now? This is the question that remains the fundamental issue in the story. So before he was proving himself to be God to the nation of Israel, now he needs to prove himself to be God again to Elijah to reaffirm his faith. Now, I'm going to just tell you, as the way this story lays out, I think Elijah plays probably into Jezebel's hands. Okay? And what I mean by that is who gains more attention? Someone who kind of flees from the scene and kind of rides off into obscurity, or a martyr? Because the fact of the matter is Jezebel probably had the opportunity to seize Elijah and probably put him to death right away instead of making this threat. And so maybe it's possible that Elijah played into her hands. She wanted this to happen to some degree, to kind of remove him from the scene. But he flees down, and what do we see as the text begins to unfold in verses 9 through 18? We see the Lord, right? He goes a day into the wilderness, and he pulls up at a juniper tree, a tree that's really not known for anything except maybe for shade. And then the angel of the Lord, he brings him baked bread and water, and he sustains him and allows him to go down to Horeb, to the mountain where God appeared to Moses. And so we see in verse 9 that he came to a cave. Now, the Hebrew in verse 9 apparently has the definite article "the" in front of it, and some have suggested or drawn the conclusion this may have been the very cave that Moses himself was in. It was that much of an illustration, but he came to this cave seemingly at the instruction of the angel. And I want you to see what is meant to reassure him here. We often, I think, or I said we, let me just drop the editorial we and just said me. I kind of jump in when I start reading this story in verse 19 and look down in as I begin to look down through this story in verse 9, I typically just kind of jump ahead to where the Lord starts kind of sending the fire and the wind and the earthquake. But what is meant to reassure Elijah in verse 9? Look again. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. That's what meant to be reassuring to Elijah. God's very words, the things that God would share with him. It wasn't just merely the presence of the Lord, but the Lord speaking to him and sharing with him and reaffirming his faith. So the very first, as he kind of then begins to reveal himself, he asks a number of questions, and then we have the wind, the earthquake, the fire, and then God being in this gentle wind or gentle whisper. Why wasn't God in the earthquake? Why wasn't God in the fire? Why wasn't God in the wind? Why was he in this gentle whisper? If y'all got a good answer for that, just let me know, but I'll give you some of the ideas. One of it, that's how God needed to appear to Elijah at this point. Elijah needed reassurance. Elijah needed succor. He needed help. He didn't need boisterous. He didn't need might. He needed to know that God was still there for him. That's a possibility. The second thing maybe is the possibility is just a reminder to Elijah that really the greatest changes in people's lives comes from God's repeated gentle actions versus one big dramatic action. I mean, Elijah went into the contest at the prophet at Mount Carmel and thought, this is it. But it didn't change the people's minds. It's going to be the repeated gentle nudgings of God. And just sometimes just showing that God works in small ways as he does big. And maybe a host of other answers, but that's how he appears to Elijah. Now, did you notice in the text that twice that God asked him a question in verse 9? What are you doing here, Elijah? Verse 13, what are you doing here, Elijah? Well, the fact is, what am I doing here? It seems like the angel told him to go there. So he's really not asking about a physical location, but he's asking spiritually, where are you at, Elijah? Where are you at right now? Where's your heart at? And he answers. And he says, your heart needs to be with me. And the rest of the text, it takes up God giving him instruction. And then at the very end of the text, in verses 19 through 21, Elijah appoints his successor, Elisha. Now, we'll come back to 19 through 21, Lord willing, next week. But I want to just think about one application and just kind of point this out to you. As you read through this story, the parallels that exist between Elijah and Moses seem almost self-evident. I mean, God appearing to him on the mount, at Horeb, at Mount Sinai. The 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness paralleling the years. The lack of bread and water but being provided by the Lord. Waiting on the cave and God passing by both. And the question is what is maybe the implications of that? I want to read this quote and then I'll kind of give you my thought. He said, without question, Elijah is one of the most distinctive and diversely talented individuals in the Bible. He is prophet, preacher, political reformer, and miracle worker all at the same time. At the heart of his multifaceted personality, though, rests one overriding conviction. Elijah hates Baalism as much as Jezebel loves the cult, and he desires to magnify Yahweh over Baal and defeat the interloping religion once and for all. He makes it his mission to teach that Yahweh lives, that Baal does not exist, and that ethical standards flow from a commitment to the living God. I think in some ways that's what the Elijah-Moses parallel leads us to. No matter how strong the individual conviction and commitment to the Lord, sometimes you can't lead the people back to him. As much as Elijah wanted to turn all of Israel back to the Lord, as much as how strong his convictions were, he was leading them, he was in the forefront. If they didn't want to go, it don't matter where Elijah was going to take them. What about Moses and leading the people out of Egypt? What had ended up happening to that generation in the wilderness? As strong as Moses' convictions were, as strong as Moses' leadership was, if the people don't want to go, they ain't going to follow. And as much as Elijah resembled Moses, at this time, Israel wasn't ready to turn back to the Lord. They still had their wilderness ahead of them. And that was going to be represented by their captivity. And then that generation would be ready for the Lord's return, their return to the Lord. And I think that parallel just seems to kind of go through the life of Elijah and move ahead to the days ahead. Thank you all. I think it might be 110 degrees in here tonight, and you all have been very patient wearing your masks for the last time. I've seen nobody pull them down. It's been tough with this humidity, so maybe, Lord willing, next Sunday, get to see each other kind of more face to face, so that'll be good. Thank you all.